This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an IRONCLAD original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. This is a best of episode, Spycraft and Intelligence, featuring conversations with former members of the intelligence community and intel analysts. Douglas London, Ric Prado, Clint Emerson, Samuel Katz, Mark Polymeropoulos, Fred Burton, David Kilcullen, and Kara Frederick. Here they are. Douglas London. Douglas London is a retired CIA operations officer and the author of the book, The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. He served as a U.S. Marine before joining the Central Intelligence Agency in 1984, where he worked for 34 years, equal time on either sides of 9/11. His job was the clandestine collection of human intelligence that comes from people who provide secrets valuable to the United States. Here's Douglas London. Now, you talk about that a lot, the paramilitary side of the house versus the case officer side of the house and what happened at 9/11 to really change the culture of the Central Intelligence Agency. And you talk about the CIA as being at a crossroads. And has it been in a crossroads since 9/11, or is this now in 2021? Are we at another crossroads now that we're essentially out of Iraq, essentially out of Afghanistan, that we're moving forward here? And how has that changed from the original charter of the CIA in 1947 to what it has become today? So what is that cultural shift? And are we at a new crossroads now in 2021? A different one maybe than we were in 2001?
Fair question. So from 9/11 on, I think less than a crossroads, we were on a descending path. We were on a path away from our charter. The CIA's charter is, in fact, foreign intelligence collection, analysis, and covert action. There's supposed to be some balance, and generally, covert action is something, if you want to keep it deniable, you don't do very much of. It's very selective. It has to be basically tested against, do we really need to do this? Is there any other way to accomplish this goal? And do we need to do it secretly, right? So can the U.S. military conduct an operation, or do we need to do it where the United States says, we don't know what you're talking about because the CIA did it? Do we need to covertly influence, or can diplomacy take care of that and just, a good narrative on the part of the government? So we slid so much towards covert action activities, and unfortunately not enough covert influence, because I actually think that's a good one and would have been very useful in countering extremism and terrorism and such like that. But really then became a very paramilitary focused organization where our goals were find, fix, finish in terms of terrorist targets. Unlike the Vietnam era, where the CIA had a huge footprint in Vietnam, it didn't really affect the overall mission. It didn't affect the overall clandestine service. There were professional paramilitary people being sent in there. There was a paramilitary mission, which they did well. And then they came back, and some were sort of rebranded and tried to put in traditional jobs, or kept in the paramilitary side. The CIA, and this part I agree with, rotated everybody through the war zones, or pretty much everybody through, on the clandestine side, on the operational side, not on the analytic or support, but a great many of them went, because obviously support tends to often be bigger than the teeth of the dog, right, in terms of making it function. So a great many of us went. But what happened was careers were being advanced not on, hey, that woman recruited a great Russian agent. It's, hey, that person ran a great platform in a war zone, or that person was part of that paramilitary program or that kinetic program. So there was less of that nurturing of classic espionage skills and tradecraft skills, and much more on the other skills. And those were the people who were then advancing, who would in turn have less classic traditional operational experience as they rose up, which would then sort of give them a different perspective on human intelligence, on the value of agents, on the value of those handling our agents, which put us, I think, on this descending path, which changed the culture. I talk in my book, and I regularly say how in my day, as even a junior officer on my first tour, I would go in and see the chief of my division, now a center chief. It's equivalent to like a general, right, in charge of literally a division of troops, right, though much smaller for us. And it would be a first name thing, because it was all about them being in touch with the workforce and then kind of charging my motivation by going, tell me about your agents. Tell me about the cool things you're doing, Doug. That simply went away, where our senior officers became chief and sir and untouchables, and in a position where they didn't want to hear a different opinion than what they had already come to conclude. That was the descending path. Crossroads today, absolutely, because there's at least a recognition that our mission has to change. It sounds kind of familiar. We need to spy on the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians. Okay, I remember that pretty well, right? That's classic espionage. We're not going to be sending, drone strikes into Moscow. We're not going to be, detaining Chinese officials and putting them in black sites. We need to recruit them as spies and run them so that they don't get caught. We need to counter Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation or cyber attacks from them, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and God knows how many criminal organizations are out there doing that. That means being smarter, not just being stronger. That's not just brute force. So we do find ourselves now at that crossroads, but it's a difficult place to be because the leadership ranks have been so built by those who profited from the last 20 years in terms of personal advancement, right? And personal professional advancement, that we didn't really reward as much those who were focused on tradecraft. And to your point, and I don't want to steal your thunder if we get to it later on accountability, when things did go wrong, rather than sort of internally, and not to the American public, God knows, but internally go, what did we do wrong? Who's responsible? And does someone need to be disciplined? It was all about circling the wagons. It was all about deflecting the accountability. And you're not going to learn from that. And you're only going to perpetuate those who made mistakes as they continue to advance, because they'll make the same mistakes again. So I think the current leadership is at a great place right now. They have the opportunity. Ambassador Burns does, Mr. Cohen does, Dave Marlowe, the new chief of the clandestine service. And these are three men that I actually respect. I've worked with all of them. I admire all of them. And I think their heart's in the right place. I see some good reflections, at least what I see publicly, in terms of people being moved out, people being moved in, and taking care of our people. The Havana Task Force, the Syndrome Task Force, I think, that was something that Gina Haspel would not do. Pompeo obviously would not even consider it. And I think that means a lot to the workforce. I think they will likewise, I hope, embrace the ideals of the diversity and inclusiveness we need. And it's not just political correctness. We're a foreign intelligence service. I'm an old white guy. Who's going to be more effective in some countries? An old white guy or somebody who can look the part, speak the language, understands the culture? It makes us a stronger intelligence service. It's not a political infantry.
Ric Prado. Ric is a retired CIA operations officer who specialized in paramilitary, counterterrorism, and special clandestine operations. He would go on to retire as the CIA equivalent of a 2-star general after serving for 24 years. He's also the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Black Ops, The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior. Here's Ric.
I was going to ask you this later, if it was appropriate, but because you bring it up now, what have you noticed over the last 20 years, 25 years, particularly maybe the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, about this country and it getting comfortable with some of those things that you saw in your family saw in Cuba, but seeing that in this country as progress? What do you feel about that, or do you notice that? I'm sure.
Absolutely, and it scares the living daylights out of me because you hit on something very astute a little while ago that I've echoed several times. We don't know how good we have it in this country. I had a lady that I was talking to a couple of months ago, and I mentioned that, and she says, "Well, I've been to Mexico." I said, "No, ma'am. You were in Cancun on a cruise. There's a difference between going to Mexico and living in Guadalajara than you going on a cruise to one of the tourist sites." And that is, it's a blessing. It is a blessing that we're so comfortable that our states are the size of other countries. We have this homogeneous, continent that we are buffered by oceans and we're just spoiled. But when people travel and live overseas, or like in my case, in my parents' case, because, everybody feels sorry for Ric. Ric is the luckiest guy in the world. I am the luckiest man in the world. I came to the best country in the world and served it and still trying to serve it, try to pay back that debt of honor. But you know who paid the price? My mom and dad. They were never the same, especially my mom, because it was a very traumatic period. So I see these trends of socialism or utopia, and let's give everybody, socialism, and I've said this before, socialism is the mask that communism wears to lure you into his lair. There is no difference between socialism and it becoming communism. And it's totalitarian, is complete control. And one thing that they do say that is true is that everybody's going to be equally be miserable, with the exception of the leadership. Mm-hmm. There's a joke in Cuba that if you see a house that has been painted in the last 50 years, that's a senior party member.
Yeah. That's why I think this is so important for Americans to read right now, particularly those that are in that formative stage in their lives where they're so impressionable, to have an appreciation for what we have. Because without books like this, without people like you talking about this and these stories, they just go to the next game on their smartphone or their TikTok video or whatever it is. And meanwhile, we're headed down that path to giving up these freedoms that so many people died for. And I mean, you write about it here in such a powerful way. You say that in school, our teachers told us to watch each other and our families. If we heard anyone saying anything against Castro, we were to report it at once. The new regime weaponized us against our own families in perfect 1984-esque fashion. Around town, every block had a designated official who recorded his neighbor's movements. Ears were always open, listening to the slightest critique of Castro, his revolution, or of Marxism in general. Once reported, those people vanished, taken in the night by the stormtroopers of the 26th of July movement. As a Marxist indoctrination soon dominated every aspect of our lives in school, life back home became a growing nightmare for the middle class. A lot of people in the town had always been jealous of my family's success. We'd endured threats before, but this seemed different. Various revolutionary committees were formed, led by some of the true dregs of our city. Now that they had achieved a level of power they hadn't under a capitalist system, they took revenge on those more successful. Yeah.
Can you imagine that when in Cuba, by the way, my wife is Cuban, she went through the same thing. She's younger and she left later. She came out in 68 or something like that, 69. But when you registered yourself for a passport, the Communist Party would show up at your house and inventory every single household item, glasses, silver spurs that my dad had, whatever it was. And when you got on that plane, before you got on that plane to leave Cuba, they would do that inventory again. And if there was anything missing, you could not leave. And it was all corruption. They were divvying up the prizes. And that was one of the reasons my dad could get out, because he had a 57 Pontiac that more than one general or captain or whatever the heck they were, wanted or lusted after. So it is, there's no hiding what communism is. And the fact that socialism is just a lure.
And I love that you talk about this, because this struck me as well. And I hadn't thought about it before, hadn't read it anywhere else before. And it's you looking back, retrospectively on what would have happened maybe had you stayed there another month, another year, another 2 years. You say your school had been tasked with selecting several of its most promising students to be sent to the Soviet Union for further education. My name was on that list. This would not have been optional. The government would simply put me on a plane to the Soviet Union, whether my parents agreed or not. In the years since, I've often wondered what would have happened to me if we had not received the tip. That's something else, the tip that told you to get out of there. Would I have ended up a Marxist too? Would I have joined an intelligence service like Cuba's version of the KGB? I'd like to think not, but the indoctrination those children were subjected to in the Soviet Union transformed most of them into revolutionary Marxists who later held positions of importance in the regime. I mean, wow, you were close to being put on a plane to the Soviet Union for further education.
Yeah, the Prado luck holds out. My uncle was my godmother's husband, who was my uncle. He was a socialist. He was a communist, let's put it that way. But blood is a little thicker than other things. And he felt compelled to tell my dad that my name was on that list. So that was what precipitated me leaving even earlier, even though they couldn't get out.
Clint Emerson. Clint is a retired Navy SEAL who served for more than 20 years. He is also the only SEAL ever to be inducted into the International Spy Museum. He's the author of the books, The Right Kind of Crazy, The Rugged Life, The Boy Scout from Hell, as well as the 100 Deadly Skills series. Here's Clint.
Came back from that deployment, and that's when they said, hey, there's a special program going on. Do you want to play? And I was like, sure. And then that's when I moved into special activities. And yeah.
Were they standing up those new teams then, or was that just kind of like a part of what you were doing?
That was that was a small part of the bigger piece. I went over to Warcom and worked directly for the Admiral. It was just me and a couple of guys, and they were like, ready, go. Just go figure it out. And we're like, figure out what? And we're like, just figure it out. Oh, okay. Well, so we started getting footholds inside embassies all over the globe, and we started basically going into sales mode. While we were in sales mode, we were also in training mode, and then getting deployments under our belt in either small teams or as singletons, and then establishing a little bit of, battlefield experience, if you will. But most of the time we weren't even inside the theaters. And really it was all about collection, against anything, right? If it financed, we wanted to know about it. If it was financing terrorism, if it was whatever, anything, any support arm of terrorism, that was the deal. It was like, go after it and be as creative as you want. And so it grew and kept growing and kept growing. And then I had an opportunity to go to the NSA, and they had one SEAL billet we put out there.
Was that a new billet, or did that already exist?
No, it was new.
Okay.
We put it there, and the Master Chief who recruited me, he went out and sat in that seat first just to kind of get a lay of the land and figure out what our job was going to be. And then I was the second guy. And then I hung out there for a while. It was kind of a hybrid. I was wearing a lot of different hats. I was running some training. I was also deploying for them. And then also, once you're in DC, you're kind of SEALs in DC end up getting leverage for all kinds of stuff. So, I was wearing a lot of hats, and it was a great experience.
Did you deploy with the NSA, or was that mostly a management type position?
No, they had a couple of gigs that I went and did that was very techie related.
Yeah. Did you have that training beforehand of that techie type stuff, or was that like on the job type stuff? So you had to do that beforehand when you're learning this new skill after that that first Iraq push. You're coming back. You're going to these different schools with a special activities kind of bent to them, getting that skill set.
Yeah. So to back up there, the training there's dozens of pipelines, right? And so I went to all of them. Anything that existed, I went to. Whether it was the agencies or DOD, anything I could find that related to any of that world, I was in it. And then I would go on deployments and kind of do a shakeout, if you will, right? I'd go over, hang out at an embassy, and then drum up work, and then sell it, right? Say, hey, this is now an NSW capability, even though they didn't know that there was just me and like one other guy at the time. Yeah. So, we'd be like, we got a lot. Yeah, we can do this. Yes. We just said yes to everything. Right. And it ended up leading to a lot of, interesting stuff. And then at the NSA, it kind of bumped it to the next level on the tech side. And then while I was up there, some Master Chiefs from down south came up for a meeting. They realized, wait, there's a SEAL up here and he knows how to do all that shit. They're like, you're coming with us. And then so I ended up at Dam Neck. And then, and then I finished the career out there.
No way. When you went to NSA, what was your rank?
I was a chief.
Okay, you're a chief by that point. I didn't know you had to pretend you were something higher. Like I'm a.
I may have
in
been
those circles.
GS, I may have been probably equivalent to like a GS-12, GS-13-ish during all that stuff, with a blue badge and, you name it. So it was you were kind of in, and the sky was the limit, really, and your imagination was the limit at the beginning. Then, once we got overseas, started kind of figuring out what our path was going to be and where we could fill gaps that other units, weren't able to do, or weren't doing. It really allowed us to lead the way to the point where some of the training pipelines I set up got accredited by SOCOM and became SOCOM programs of record, along with the technology. If you remember, there was a lot of these kits that started getting pushed out to the teams. And, that was, just, whatever, 6 of us that really kind of laid the foundation to get all that out there. And then, heck, man, it just took off after that. It had, just like any program, it had a lot of ups and downs and a lot of characters and leadership that come along. The deal. Or some leaders are like, yeah, I support this. And others are like, I'm pulling your budget. And it's like, okay, it's a little bit of a roller coaster, but it eventually planed out. And, it has served the community really well, I think, in a lot of ways that most of the community will never know about.
Yeah, that's amazing. What was your favorite part of that training that's different than most SEAL training, the stuff that we normally do? And for those listening, we go to like land warfare training, the mountain warfare training, close quarter battle stuff. You go to the urban combat, you dive, you jump, you do all these different things. And what Clint's talking about is definitely different outside of that realm. What was your favorite part of that different side of training, if you can talk about it?
Yeah. Well, the comparison I like to use, and I know you'll appreciate it, is the Jedburgh teams of World War II, which was, these Jedburghs were started by the OSS. And if people don't know, that's the Office of Strategic Services. And they were the predecessor to the CIA. And those Jedburghs were a coalition team, right? You had usually a Brit, a Frenchman, and of course an American. And they would jump in behind enemy lines and run sabotage, reconnaissance, you name it, in Nazi territory. And one of their biggest responsibilities was to be gray, right? They had to, as soon as they'd land by parachute in the middle of the night, they immediately would throw on the clothing that the villagers wore, depending on where they were operating in the country. And they immediately had to assume projection and demeanor skills so that if they were co-located with Nazis that were driving by and, occupied territory, they just had to blend in with everyone else. And so I think, when you fast forward and you add technology and you add a whole lot of just cool stuff, that's probably the closest comparison I can make to the kind of things that we were involved in. Training wise, I mean, man, there was so many, when you're a SEAL, it's body armor, night vision, guns, and, and you've got your 22 buddies. With this world, it was business casual, business class, and you didn't have your 22 buddies with you, right? So it was a complete 180 to taking your alpha male kind of instincts and demeanor and aura and subduing it with penny loafers and a calculator watch if necessary, right? So, but at the same time, kind of cool. It was like, I'm, you get on a plane and to go do whatever, and you're on your own. That was probably the best part. And then later, I started to really specialize in CMOE, which is clandestine methods of entry, and another program that I got to build from ground up, and did it the same way I built the others. Was you got to get trained, and then you got to immediately just get overseas and start putting it to use. And so, being able to get in to vessels, vehicles, structures, and containers is really what we focused on. Being able to get in with zero forensics and zero attribution in the United States government was the number one goal. And so with that comes a lot of technology and a whole lot of different operational risk factors that, most people have no idea. I would say a CMOE operation is probably one of the most, it takes a lot. There's a lot involved. I can't go into it, but I mean, there's a lot more than just walking up to a door and looking at the doorknob and, and going inside. I mean, there's a lot to it. And that especially when you talk about cameras, alarm systems. There is a world of sensors that we had to overcome. And when you talk about like a worst case scenario target where they have, 5 layers to their perimeter before you even get to the door, you can imagine, right? It gets a little crazy. So, that was all probably the best stuff that I got to play around in. Yeah,
that's incredible. And then when you get to development group, you continue to do kind of the same thing, just on that side of the house, some of the similar things you were doing with NSA, but now you're doing it just for a military specific entity.
Yeah, you could say that.
So,
I mean,
I'm trying to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, like that world is it's massive, right? So you get a lot of people that come knocking on doors saying, "Hey, can you guys go do this for us?" So I would say a majority of like the work was always for other folks, and we were always going, yes, right? We're the proverbial hookers in SOCOM. We just say yes to everything and go for it. So it's but yeah, that's pretty much everything I did was always for someone else for the most part. I'd say it was very rarely for NSW.
Hey everyone, it's Jack Carr here. Just in time for the holidays, I am launching a new collaboration with my friends at KC Cattle Company. KC is a veteran-owned company out of Missouri, and they raise some of the best beef in the country. This limited release collaboration will include 2 different steak bundle options. One bundle is geared toward the entire family and includes KC Cattle Company's award-winning Wagyu uncured beef hot dogs. And a second bundle option, my favorite, will include something special: a massive Wagyu tomahawk steak and a Cross Tomahawks branding iron. Awesome. These limited release bundles drop in late November, so be on the lookout for more release information soon, exclusively through the officialjackcarr.com shop. Be the first to find out about my latest collaborations and more by signing up for the Jack Carr newsletter at officialjackcarr.com. Samuel Katz. Samuel Katz is an expert on the Middle East, counterterrorism, and special operations. He's the former editor of the trade publication Special Operations Report and is the author of more than 20 books, to include his latest, No Shadows in the Desert: Murder, Vengeance, and Espionage in the War Against ISIS. Here's Sam Katz.
And what's interesting to me is that both of those 2 people detonated these SVSS belts, whatever they were, killing wife, children, innocents. And then you have Osama bin Laden, who has an AK in his room, in his compound in Pakistan. There are shots fired. They're not suppressed as part of that raid as the operators are moving in and working their way up the stairwell. People died defending him. He obviously sent people to their deaths for a long number of years. And in the end, he did not grab that AK, did not grab that Kalashnikov and defend himself or his family. He didn't detonate an S-vest, but he did not grab that weapon that was within arm's reach either. So it was interesting to me, just the difference between these 2 guys, between al-Baghdadi and his predecessor, and bin Laden. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that the higher you go up with the food chain, in many cases, first of all, I don't think that bin Laden ever expected that there'd be knocks on the door, and they wouldn't be the Uber Eats guy from the local shawarma place. I think he thought he was well protected because nobody had come to him previously. We don't know yet if the vests that were detonated on Baghdadi and the others were self-detonated or maybe remote. I know that from a lot of the incidents in Israel, the terrorists who were so eager to send men and women to their deaths with devices strapped to their bodies are the first ones to raise their hand and surrender. The notion of martyrdom is good when it's somebody else.
That's a great line. That is a fantastic line. I'm going to write that down, actually.
Write it down. I think a way to look at this is that terrorism in many ways is a business for these people. Mm-hmm. And the bosses want to live the good life. You know, in the world of terrorism, there's money, there's power. These are all very attractive commodities for bosses, for their families, and it trickles down like any organized crime entity. Terrorism is a criminal enterprise. The ideology and the religious part are components of it, but it's all about money and power and wielding your weapon and getting what you want. And I think that moving forward, maybe one of the weapons, and I think that it's becoming part of the military operational guideline, is making them poor. What's the line from the movie Trading Places? The best way to get even with rich people is to make them poor. The Israelis started doing that years ago when they began targeting the money.
Is that Harpoon? Is that what you read about in Harpoon?
Yes.
That's the one I haven't read. I need to. I just ordered it though before I jumped on this podcast.
Mayor Dagan, who was the head of the Mossad, he had learned that in the West Bank that there was money flowing in. The terrorist groups were building schools and hospitals and markets and employing people, and all of a sudden Mercedes were popping up, and kids were going to schools overseas. And where's the money coming from? And the money was coming in from places like the Gulf and Iran, and the same thing for Al Qaeda, the same thing for ISIS, and the same thing for every other terrorist group. Would the 9/11 hijackers have been able to carry out their attack if they couldn't afford flying lessons, if they couldn't afford all of this? Funding the money element of terrorism is integral to everything. And I think when we look at in the future, hopefully much less than in the past, that we take a more holistic approach and take different pillars of their fortress and dismantle them simultaneously, as opposed to kind of doing military on. It's important to take away the perks of what being on the most wanted list and having safe houses and all that comprise.
I'm interested. I'm looking forward to reading that Harpoon. I hadn't. I'm really looking forward to reading that. Should be here in a few days. But can you talk about who Abu Omar al-Shishani was? And I think I have something I wanted to read about that, because the writing in this is aside from what you're talking about, is just it's so well done. I mean, I love this. 16 top Islamic State field commanders greeted Abu Omar al-Shishani as he walked toward a darkened staircase in the cellar of a 2-story home that was large enough for at least 3 families. The men looked tired, but they had become energized to see al-Shishani and his phalanx of bodyguards. A highly detailed map was spread across a large dining room table. Smaller maps were spread across chairs and draped on the wall. Small fluorescent light bulbs illuminated the room. The air inside was stifling with cigarette smoke. A fan buzzed as it twirled a steady rotation and blew a slight breeze of air inside a room that was crowded and stifling. The lieutenants parked their Toyota Land Cruisers far away from the house so that satellites and drones wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly where the high-level gathering was taking place. The American combat aircraft approached from the east, from the rising sun, and through the established corridor of the attack against the Islamic State. The aircraft snuck in completely by surprise and were not subjected to anti-aircraft fire. The 500-pound precision bombs that were launched against the building hit at dawn's first light. The destruction of the 2-story structure was absolute. All that was left of the building was a 45-meter deep smoldering crater. No one survived the attack. I mean, that's great writing. I mean,
Thank you.
You could have just been, hey, they were in the house and the bombs dropped and they were done. But the writing is fantastic there. But can you talk a little bit about him and how that mission came about, how they targeted him?
He was Georgian by nationality. Had come to the masterminds of 9/11 came from many parts of the Middle East, where the jails had been emptied and people allowed to travel. And the same thing, ISIS attracted a rogues gallery of the who's who of bad guys. And he was one of them. He was the military commander, their chief of staff, so to speak, who was always, he was meant to be an icon of the organization. He had a big red beard. He looked different in many ways than the others. He liked to be photographed. But because he moved in such secretive circles, it was very hard to target him. And a lot of these individuals had either been prisoners of or had served in an intelligence or counterintelligence agency, which is why ISIS was so effective, because a lot of the people had military training before they went in. And then they just took all the lessons that they learned when they beat prisoners to extract confessions. They just took that information and they put it into their standard operating procedures. What made the Jordanian operation successful was the fact that tribes or operatives in the GID in Amman could call a counterpart, a relative, someone in the clan who was in Iraq or in Syria, and kind of say, we're looking for this guy. And out of duty and out of honor, that information was easy to obtain because that person in the targeted country had resources and business dealings, and people spoke. And they had, the world was very intermingled, intertwined with individuals. But of course, these are individuals that are off limits to the West. And it wasn't the kind of thing, or there wasn't the kind of information that Connex boxes full of cash could buy. A lot of times these were assets on the ground that operated by a system of loyalty of the desert that we couldn't understand. And the Jordanians could. The Jordanians had their fingers in it. And it was easy for them to find out where certain things were happening using sources. And they were able to get that information back to their commanders quickly. And then that information was acted upon quickly by coalition air forces. And I think it's important to discuss that operationally and tactically, strategically, tactically, and overall operationally. The working together of the Jordanian military and intelligence services and those of this country were, in many cases, seamless and very successful.
Mark Polymeropoulos. For more than 25 years, Mark was a critical member of the U.S. intelligence community, specializing in counterterrorism, human intelligence collection, and covert action. During his time at the CIA, which included assignments in Afghanistan and Iraq, he received the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, and the Intelligence Medal of Merit. He's the author of the book Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. Here's Mark.
So, everything did change on 9/11 for everybody, as you know, because, we shifted so much to a counterterrorism focus. And then I spent, the majority of the rest of my career doing CT work until the end, where I did more on Russia. But your regular job as a case officer, where you're posted either overseas out of a U.S. government facility, the agency with all their kind of craziness, as you know, about pre-publication stuff. I'm like, you can't say it's an embassy, but of course it's an embassy. I think you went through some of that stuff and getting your books cleared too.
I did.
Right? Yep.
I did.
But ultimately, your job as an operations officer is you have a couple kind of key tasks. One is primarily you're supposed to recruit new agents, new assets, and let me make a good point for everyone, your readers. I know you know this. That there's CIA officers. An agent is a foreigner who we recruit. There are no CIA agents who look like me, in terms of actually U.S. government employees. But ultimately, we're looking for people who have access to privileged information, non-public information. So you're looking at Iranian nuclear scientists or Chinese military officers or Russian intelligence officers. Pakistani military officers. But we are trying to penetrate those governments to gain information that help our policymakers make the correct decisions. So my job is to find individuals, however I can, and then you assess their vulnerabilities. And that's really the most interesting part of kind of intelligence work, at least it was for me, is because it's a human. It's a human aspect of it, because I'm looking at that you have access to information we need. Well, now, do you have something where you're vulnerable? What kind of motivations do you have? Maybe ideologically you're not attuned, or you're not in tune with your own home country. You believe in the United States and our principles of economic and political freedom. Maybe you have money issues. Maybe you want your kid to go to Yale or whatever. So ultimately, I'm looking for something that's going to get a hook into someone to have them commit espionage and provide information to the United States government. And it's actually, being an intelligence officer in the United States is not, it's a really good thing, because it's America. You don't have to sell America. America, regardless of anything that's happening now in our political sphere, is still seen by the rest of the world as a land of political and economic freedom. One of the things that I lived overseas in the third world, so I appreciate this country, warts and all, because the other side of things ain't so pretty. And so ultimately, but that's what I did. So I was running agents and recruiting agents, and then of course working with foreign governments at all. We call it liaison. So we would have a relationship with another country's intelligence service where we kind of work together behind the scenes, and that was done against traditional targets. So again, as I said before, Russians, Chinese, Iranians, North Koreans, and then 9/11 happens, and our focus certainly shifts to counterterrorism.
Yeah. And so in those pre 9/11 years, were you ever involved with a handoff of an agent? Like, what is that like? If you develop this trust with someone in one of these foreign nations, and then you're there for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, whatever it might be, and then you have to go, maybe you leave the agency, you retire, whatever it is, but you have to do a handoff with somebody new. Like, how dicey is that? I'm sure every situation is a little bit different, but now this person who's put their trust in you all of a sudden has the new guy to figure out and develop that trust with them. And that just seems like a tough one to hand off, especially when you're dealing with life and death situations.
Now, Jack, that's a great question. And that's actually what I was not really good at. So I was a very good recruiter. I have this outgoing personality. I'm Greek, which means when I was serving in the Middle East, they kind of identified, with us. I was in one Middle Eastern country one time, and I remember someone actually said, well, I know you work at the U.S. Embassy, but you can't be a spy because you're actually Greek. And I'm like, that's what you want to think. That works for me. But ultimately, when I would recruit an asset, a lot of times it would end up being based on the personal ties that I had developed with them. And when it came to do what we call turnover and really institutionalize a relationship, because guess what? They're not spying for me. They're spying for, Uncle Sam. I actually had trouble with that sometimes, because and even if this agent was giving us great stuff, he'd be like, I'm not going to do that I'm not going to do that turnover. Why don't you just stay? And I'd be like, well, because I got to go home. I've been here for 3 years. Yeah. And so I actually always had trouble with that. And so what I learned kind of later on is when you develop these relationships in the developmental stage, and when you actually formally recruit someone, you got to make sure it's done, through that this is a relationship with the CIA that individual is having, but also kind of start weaving in, early on that, okay, I'm not going to be here the whole time. Right. It's just our system is such that we turn over our agents. And there's a reason for that, because you want it to be institutionalized. But you got to remember, and the most incredible part about being an operations officer to me was that it's almost like a Psych 501 class. This individual, by the way, has put their life in my hands. Right. And so that is an incredible amount of responsibility I have. Well, from that person's standpoint, I got to break someone else in, because I trust Mark. Mm-hmm. But am I going to trust, Suzanne or John or Jessica or whoever it is coming next? Mm-hmm. I don't know. And so that's hard. And you got to look at it from their perspective, because again, especially when you go after some of these really harder targets, the price for failure is not good. Right. And I tell a story in the book one time about an agent I was training, and he looked at me and we're actually in Europe. I was training him on a communication system. He was going back into his home country in the Middle East. But he said to me, look, and he was unbelievable. He goes, I get this, but let me just tell you something. I know that, we're going to meet probably once a month in our very careful surveillance detection routes, in our tradecraft, and the techniques we use to meet clandestinely an agent on the streets of a denied area. He said, he says, Mark, I know you're going to think of me maybe a couple times a month. He goes, but I'm going to think about you every single day, because if you make one mistake, I'm going to die and my whole family, my whole tribe's going to die. So just, you never forget that. And I was blown away by that. I mean, because that's a hell of a lot of responsibility. And I know what you did in your past, Jack, and there was a hell of a lot of responsibility. And so it's kind of one of those times where you sit back, you're like, you know what, I can't mess up, because if I do this, I have this person's life in my hands. And that makes you really, that makes you work harder. That makes you want to be better. And certainly, take this job very seriously.
Yeah. Geez. And having done that study of Afghanistan, knowing the players, kind of getting there, after the Soviets withdrew, but having an understanding of the culture already, the players already. When 9/11 happened, where were you on 9/11? And then did you right away know, I know what this is, I know exactly what this tie is, or how did that take shape for you?
Oh boy, what a great question. So actually, and I got to be careful on how I say this. I was posted in the New York area.
Got it.
On 9/11. In fact, we were not there that day. We were in Greece on vacation, but my daughter's daycare center was in World Trade Center 5. So I would have been dropping her off at that time. I came back right away. Actually, I kind of, we were stuck in Greece. There was no flights back. I remember with my young children going to the front of the line, one of the first flights out of Europe, out of Athens. The airport was packed, and I told my kids, I said, act sick. And so we walked up there. It wouldn't work now with COVID.
No.
We walked up there, and I was like, I have a sick child. I have to get back. And they actually let us get on the plane. So I made it back home, and then from there, I was actually seconded to the what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Force out of the FBI field office in New York City, because I spoke Arabic. And so, off we went. And I remember, only days after 9/11, we were walking through the rubble. These things always stayed with me, because, there was a tremendous loss of life of course, of Americans, but also of both, New York City Fire Department and police department as well. But I remember seeing there was a New York City policeman playing a bagpipe. This is only the place is still burning. It's smoldering, and it was the middle of the night. And we were doing something that I think we were trying to recover trying to recover obviously personnel, but also documents and things like that. And you're hearing this individual playing the bagpipe just kind of blew me away. And look, I remember some of I was lucky enough to run a CIA paramilitary base years later in Afghanistan, 10 years after the anniversary of 9/11. And the indigenous personnel, the Afghans, still had some baseball hats that one of my predecessors had all given the team, which were New York NYPD hats. And so just, really emotional times from being in New York City during that time period.
Yeah. So interesting. So you got to hop on a flight fairly soon after 9/11 and have a transatlantic flight, meaning you had time to think a little bit. For a lot of us, it was go, go, go. I was already deployed. And so we figured we were going to Afghanistan. We ended up going to Kuwait instead and do some shipboarding stuff on Iraq and the oil embargo thing. But you had time to reflect for a second on that flight. And a lot of people didn't have that time because they were in it, especially if you're military or in intelligence services.
Right.
So what are you thinking on that flight? Are you thinking about Al-Qaeda? Are you thinking about bin Laden? Are you thinking about how he's a guest of the Taliban? Are you thinking about U.S. response possibilities, what those could be? Like, what is that flight like for you when you have time, those hours in the air to reflect?
So I'll tell you what I was thinking. And this is reflective of a lot of CIA personnel. I was thinking we failed. And we failed in an almost impossible task. I mean, it's almost asking, I don't know what kind of sports analogy, you're a soccer goalie. We let one pass. Well, it's hard, but we failed. And I think, but based on that failure, you're driven, and this is a terrible, not a terrible thing to say because it's not a professional thing to say, but you're driven for revenge. We're supposed to not have that feeling in our line of work. You don't do things to get revenge on people, but you kind of do.
Hey, it's a very human, it's part of human nature.
And so, but ultimately is that, we knew who it was immediately. There was no doubt. When they ran the manifest, the flight manifest, they saw right away, but ultimately is that, we failed. And even though CIA was warning, in presidential daily briefs, even though there was a kind of a robust effort on collection certainly on Osama bin Laden, we failed. And so, now it's, the famous line is, today's September 12th. And that was kind of our line every day for years.
Right.
And so, but it was a feeling of that we let one go, and a feeling that, of responsibility.
So what do you do then attached to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or what do you do during the time before you go to Afghanistan? Because you get there to Afghanistan in 2003-ish, or when
I got there in February, March 2002. So
okay.
So when I was
so that's pretty quick.
It was quick, and I left New York fairly soon after that to go to a Middle Eastern post to get kind of closer to the fight. And this is very similar probably to your old line of work. Everyone's begging to go. Like I feel our headquarters personnel, everyone's on the phone with that. They it's just like, get me on the next plane out there. And in fact, you couldn't. I mean, they had to do this right and organize teams correctly. But you have to remember that in the days after 9/11, there was a total, complete fear that there was another attack coming.
Yeah.
And so, and especially, so, if I'm working with the FBI in New York City, are there cells in New York? Are there sleeper cells or the other things, and kind of piecing together the logistics network that, Al Qaeda had used. And so, but there was just, incredible fear of this. And, we're going to go down a road I probably don't want to go, but you think about, some of the things the U.S. government did with enhanced interrogation techniques and all the things that we did afterwards. Everything was based on that fear that not if, but when there was another attack coming, and we had to stop that because we missed the first one. And so, so ultimately it was just working overdrive to make sure that didn't happen. We didn't know if there's sleeper cells in Queens or the Bronx, or Brooklyn. I mean, and so you just had to run down every lead, and then of course ultimately, a lot of the focus did shift, out to South Asia.
November 11th is Veterans Day, but at Navy Federal Credit Union, every day is Veterans Day. I've been a member since 1996, right after boot camp and right before I went to BUDS, or SEAL training. Navy Federal Credit Union is for active duty veteran DoD employees and their families. They offer resources like the VA Loans Hub and Best Cities After Service. They offer veteran employment assistance partnerships with nonprofits like The Mission Continues. They're a top VA home loan lender. They offer personal finance counseling. They offer 24/7 member service and are a growing community of over 1.8 million veterans just like you. Learn more at NavyFederal.org/veterans. Insured by NCUA, an equal housing lender. Fred Burton. Fred is a former police officer, Diplomatic Security Service Special Agent, author, and security consultant. His books include his memoir, Ghost, Confessions of a Counter-terrorism Agent, Chasing Shadows, and Under Fire, the untold story of the attack in Benghazi. He is also the author of Beirut Rules, the murder of a CIA station chief and Hezbollah's war against America. Here's Fred.
The largest reward we paid under my watch, Jack, was to the informant that set up Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing.
Yeah.
So we paid that guy $1.2 million and put him inside of the witness security program.
Okay.
So our office.
That's amazing. So how did you get involved with that one? Because that one is bombing World Trade Center. He escapes and is in the Philippines, hatching another plot to bomb multiple airliners in the Pacific region on or around January, February timeframe of 95, I want to say. So
right.
94, he's in the Philippines, tests a bomb, a successful bomb, didn't bring the aircraft down, but killed, I think, one person, and then used that as a test run for Operation Bojinka, I think they called it. And there's a fire in the apartment, one of those, whether it was random or somebody, they're doing something, who knows, but suspicious fire department shows up in Manila. And I think it was Manila, and
it was,
and find, hey, there's some suspicious here. Some guy runs off, and then that really led to the unraveling of that plot. But he still made it from there to Pakistan.
He did.
And that's where you tracked him down.
Right. The backstory was, when the World Trade Center was bombed the first time in 93, we obviously utilized the Rewards for Justice program to try to apprehend those who were responsible for that. And my office actually deployed agents to the bombing scene. A good friend of mine, Scotty Stewart, went up with our portable Aegis explosive detector device and drove that up to New York to work the crime scene. Our New York field office was involved. Obviously the FBI was responsible for the overall crime scene investigation, but it was a multi-agency effort with ATF, FBI, NYPD. Our office was engaged. Our New York field office was heavily involved. And so when the fire happened in Manila, the U.S. Embassy regional security officer at the time, which is, overseas in the State Department, special agents are the regional security officers or an assistant regional security officer. And he cabled in what had happened. And of course, we offered our help to the Philippine National Police. And if memory serves me right, they did take advantage of that. We offered our forensic and investigative assistance, and we eventually got our hands on, some of the laptops and some of the data at the time. And, that fire was set. I believe that he was cooking explosives and set the apartment on fire, if memory serves me right. It's been a while now. And then he fled from there, and he went around and then ultimately wound up in Pakistan. So during this time period, we were getting sightings of Yosef all over the world. And I had, by, sheer last man standing, I had somehow managed to become the deputy chief of our unit. And it certainly was no great feat on my part. I just think I had been there longer than anybody else, and nobody else wanted the damn job, right?
It's possible. No.
Yeah, nobody else wanted the job, and nobody else wanted to write employee performance reviews. So I was pretty good at that. Anyway, so Yosef, we have him all over the place, and we had all kinds of fraud, just information peddlers. Everybody's trying to get their hands on the reward monies for Yosef. And I got a call on the secure voice phone one day when I'm in the office. And we called it the bat phone, right?
Nice.
And I pick it up, and it was the regional security officer in Islamabad. And he was a great guy I'd known. I had worked a previous case with him. And so I knew he was a damn good investigator. And he goes, Fred, we've had a walk-in here. And he's not really a walk-in, but I don't want to get into details right now. But I think this informant is good. And so I kind of leaned back, it's like, yeah, okay. Well, you're about the 20th person to call me this week with a good informant. And he goes, no, no BS. I think this guy's pretty good. And I said, okay, I believe you. And literally, to make a long story short, I cover this in Ghost. The informant had befriended Yosef and got nervous, Jack, because he was being used as a courier run, as a dummy run, to carry these little baby dolls onto planes. And Yosef's intentions, back to the Bojinka plot, was to take these baby doll bombs and fan them out on different flights and blow up several different airliners. And so our informant had carried one of these devices, and on his last trial run, the light bulb went off in his head saying, I may not come off on the next plane that I'm on.
Right. Here's another trial run for you. And it's not the trial run.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, I'm sure with, the teams for you guys, who wants to volunteer?
Voluntold is more like how it works there.
Yeah, exactly. So he...
Did they ever make it through with those with actual explosives in there, or was it just the shell, like making it
just
through?
The shell, Jack?
Yeah.
Provided the guy was telling us the truth,
right.
Which I believe him. He turned out to be a solid informant that gave us Yosef. And he had said to our agents that initially debriefed him that he had seen a Rewards for Justice poster, and he said, "I know this. I know this guy. He's going to contact me," and that led to kind of the unraveling. And so when our agents called me, I said, "Well, okay, tell him to call us when Yosef shows back up." And lo and behold, Yosef showed back up. I think it was within a 36-hour window. And, the rest is kind of history.
Incredible. When that happened, I was traveling in Australia, New Zealand in that December, January timeframe. And I remember I think it was flying out of New Zealand, went to Australia, but flying out of New Zealand. But regardless, I'd never seen security switch like that. Like as I'm there, I see everything start to change, and I see lines not just forming through the regular security, but once you got to the gate, all your bags checked, your shoes off, everyone individually checked before they went and got on the plane. And the whole atmosphere had changed in that airport while I was waiting there. I think it was early January of 95, I think. But you could see it because it was one of those routes that may have been targeted. So heading home from Australia, from New Zealand during that time frame. But it was interesting to see security change. I'd never seen that before. And then a year later, I find out, what it was, why they were doing that. Crazy. But you're involved in all these things. And now Ramzi Ahmed Youssef is serving a lot of time at the Supermax prison in Colorado.
Yeah. Jack, I've gotten way, way too much credit for that. My role was, I did what any of us would have done during that time frame to capture this guy. One of the things that still drives me crazy, Jack, is I know he was in Islamabad to carry out some sort of attack. And for the life of me, we never could figure out what he was up to. And so, my gut told me at the time that, you have to step back and look at this time period. He had already blown up the World Trade Center the first time. He had planned to kill the Pope in the Philippines. He had planted bombs on airplanes coming out of the South Pacific. Yeah. And now he's in Islamabad, and he was walking around the diplomatic enclave with our informant, looking for homes. And I think he was very much trying to plan an attack to go after a Western diplomat of some kind, probably with some sort of bomb, but I don't know. And that was one of those kinds of things that there's so many of these cases, Jack, that just haunt me because, you know the target that was hit, but you don't really know all the other targets that were looked at to get to that point.
Right. Right. He certainly wasn't there on vacation or just to retire. He was a very active person.
Right. And, during that time period, the geopolitics of Pakistan were such that, we were dealing with, in many ways, the ISI, which was a hostile intelligence agency, where their loyalties lied at any given time, was almost trying to work with the KGB.
Right.
When you started to, get down to it. And so it was just, there was really no rules with these folks.
Wow. That's amazing. And where did Carlos the Jackal fit into all this? He's on your desk from day one.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, Jack, because, in my generation, when I started, he was the poster child of terror.
Right. And I have a book over there called The New Jackals from back in the mid-90s, maybe late 90s, I forget. But I have a whole section here of books that I've collected over time, some of these older books on terrorism from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But yeah, The New Jackals is in there and has that title for a reason.
Yeah, he was literally the poster child. And I remember as a cop reading about Carlos the Jackal. He was this guy that was all around the world carrying out these terrorist attacks. He had done the OPEC summit. He had assassinated a Jewish businessman in London. He was a paid hitman. And, he was working for Gaddafi. He was swimming in all these leftist radical circles with, the old Italian Red Brigades, the Red Army faction, the Japanese Red Army, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command. And he was living and moving with all these circles. So he was kind of like the poster child for somebody that you could never catch.
Right.
And I would sit there in my office and think, my goodness, we have Interpol, we have the CIA, we have U.S. Special Forces, we have MI6, we have everybody looking for this guy. Why can't we find him? And he was, being utilized as a nation state gun for hire. So he was traveling under pseudonyms and aliases on diplomatic passports. And so it's kind of an interesting kind of bookend to your question, because if you fast forward many, many years later to after Chasing Shadows came out, I get a call in my office one day, many years after I've left the government, from the FBI in Paris. And they said, hey, we saw your book and we want to reopen this case. And they said, well, who would you interview if you were us? And I said, I would try to get to Carlos the Jackal, because I could never get to him to talk to him directly. As a sidebar, Jack, I had been corresponding with his first wife, Magdalena Kopp, who had been a terrorist herself. And she was very helpful. It was amazing to me, and still is, the people that will answer my emails. But
That's incredible.
She had been corresponding with me and talking to me about Carlos, and I was asking her questions about the Alon murder, back in the 70s. And she said, well, if anybody would know, Carlos would know. So I pointed the FBI in that direction, and they did some follow-up interviews with Carlos, and I signed a bunch of books for them, and I actually shipped them off to the FBI, and they gave one to Carlos.
No way. That's incredible.
I don't think he liked it, but
that is too cool.
That's my Carlos story.
Thank you so much to Sig Sauer for jumping right on board out of the gate to make this podcast possible. Obviously, I am a huge Sig fan, having carried the P226 on every deployment downrange in the SEAL teams. But Sig was a supporter. They were friends well before I was a New York Times bestselling author, well before I even had an Instagram account or any social media presence whatsoever. So thank you guys all so much. Ron, Tom, Jason, everybody at SIG who gets up every day and continues to crush it and lead the way. SIG is always adapting. They're always at the forefront, whether it is firearms for citizens, whether it's firearms for our military, ammo, suppressors, optics, training, fire control units. They are doing it all, and they are always pushing that envelope and trying to do it better each and every day through innovation and adaptation. They crush. So thank you so much for that friendship and support. It will never be forgotten. David Kilcullen. David is one of the world's foremost counterinsurgency experts and is the author of the books The Accidental Guerrilla, Counterinsurgency, Out of the Mountains, Blood Year, and The Ledger. He served in the Australian military for more than 20 years before being recruited as the chief strategist in the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department. He was also a counterinsurgency advisor to NATO and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. Here's David. And that became the basis for my fourth novel, What the Enemy Has Learned by Watching Us on the Field of Battle for the last 20 years. And I always wanted to write something about that because I thought a lot about that during my time in uniform. I continued to think about that as a citizen, as an author, what the enemy's learning by watching, because we've been essentially playing poker for the last 20 years here, and they've been looking at our cards, seeing how we play those cards, taking notes, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. And that's a long period of time to be able to do that. And in the novel, I look at two distinctly different periods. I go back to about 1979 to, I go 1953 briefly, but 79 to 2001 onward. And I have some older characters that talking about Iran. And I had some characters that are older that grew up during that time in the 80s and early 90s. And hey, what did they learn during that time frame? And then what did they learn during that next period is when we're talking about terrorism, that different paradigm there. What do they learn in those two distinctly different periods? And that brings, to Dragons and the Snakes. I mean, point being, I wanted to always write about that. So it was in my wheelhouse. And then I talked to somebody in Argentina in 2017 who mentioned a few things about security pre 9/11 in airports and post 9/11 in airports. And I started thinking about those things. And then I figure, okay, now is the time to sit down and write this novel. And then that's right about the time that this came out. So early 2020, Dragons and the Snakes comes out, and I'm reading it. And that really framed how I wanted to explore those themes in this fourth novel. And that's all due to you from
not just me, mate. I mean, I know you get out and talk to a lot of people, and you have a lot of your own field research too, but I'm happy to contribute a little bit. Yeah.
Well, no, it was fantastic. It really brought all that together for me as I started down the path of writing this. But when you say the Dragons and the Snakes, for those who haven't read the book, what are you talking about?
Well, it's actually not my phrase. It comes from Jim Woolsey, who was President Clinton's first CIA director. And when he was doing his confirmation hearing, so if you want to be the head of an agency and you get nominated by the president, you have to be approved by the Senate, and you go through a whole process for that. And when Woolsey was giving his confirmation testimony in February of 1993, so about maybe 15 months after the end of the Cold War, one of the people on the committee said, well, how do you see the next 10 years of sort of post-Cold War environment? And he said, we've slain a large dragon, talking about the Soviet Union, but now we find ourselves in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of snakes. And in many ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of. So by dragon, he means, peer adversary, great power states with nuclear weapons, like the Soviet Union. By dragons, he goes on to talk about basically weak states, failing states, and non-state actors. So when I decided to write this book, the first person that I spoke to was actually Jim Woolsey, and I met with him a couple of times as I was writing the book. He's a fabulous guy, very knowledgeable on all kinds of different ranges of threats, not shy about expressing his point of view, not in any way politically correct, he's very, very direct. And we had a great conversation about basically how we screwed it up, right? And how ideas that were pretty obvious to them in the 1990s, we somehow lost that during the war on terror. And basically the argument of the book is, for 10 years after the Cold War, from 91 to 2001, we focused on snakes, right? Weak states, non-state actors, failing states, Rwanda, Somalia, Liberia, all the stuff we did in the 1990s. After 9/11, we narrowed that focus to just one snake, international jihadist terrorism. And we had such a narrow focus that everybody else was able to adapt around us and do all that learning that we've just been talking about. Today, we're in like a post-Woolseyan environment where the dragons are back. China, Russia, to some extent, Iran and North Korea, but really China and Russia are back in a great power competition. I hear people saying we should avoid getting into a Cold War with the Chinese. Dude, we are already in a Cold War with the Chinese. We've been in one. They've been in one with us for years. We just have just started to wake up. And so what I wanted to show is how China, Russia, all of the terrorist organizations, Iran, the North Koreans, how they've learned in that period since Woolsey. So basically I have a chapter where I talk a lot about non-state actors and how they learn, and I have a theory chapter, talking about application of a bunch of ideas from evolutionary theory, right, to how people adapt in a warfighting environment. And then I have a big, long chapter on Russia, a big one on China, and shorter ones on Iran and North Korea. For the Russia chapter, I actually went up to the Arctic border between Norway and Russia.
That was fascinating. I wanted to take that and just do another book on that. I feel like I should not read when they come out, read them cover to cover. I should just pick a chapter and then start my next novel. Like just get a spark or something to explore and start that next chapter. But that was fascinating. Yeah. What inspired you to go up there as part of this research? Was there something that stuck out?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. One, I love the Norwegians. I don't know if you work with them much, but
I haven't, but I always wanted to. I missed that part.
Yeah, they're just fantastic. And for an army their size, of a nation their size, I'd say no one beats them in terms of quality, and particularly their special forces are just outstanding. And the Norwegians played a really big role in a number of the campaigns, obviously since 9/11. I knew a bunch of guys from Afghanistan and elsewhere. and I'd been invited to go to Oslo to speak at a conference talking about the future of potential conflict with the Russians. And I was like, I'll come, and you don't have to pay me, of course, but I'll do a little contra deal. Take me up to the Russian border. There's a special unit up there. It's sort of like, elves running around on the border of Mordor, hanging out in the forest with the Eye of Sauron, looking at them. This tiny little unit, it's about 600 people, very elite. You're about 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's all forest and swamp and tundra. And on the other side is basically the entire Russian Arctic, Northern Fleet, plus about 3 divisions of airborne troops and motor rifle troops. It's a huge amount of Russian firepower on the other side of this tiny little border. And half of it is water, so a little small boat type river, and half of it is forest. So I managed to go out with these guys for a few days and talk to them. They hide in these little OPs, keeping an eye on the Russians, moving around by small boat. And I managed to, ride about half the border on quad bike in the forest, right up to the edge of the border, like a couple of feet from Russia. What's astounding when you see that is how much gear the Russians have up there, right, in terms of like electronic attack, sophisticated aircraft. There's a whole nuclear submarine bastion up there, but they've also got like an entire brigade of VDV, so airborne troops that can like drop in with weapons. They got assault hovercraft. There's all this stuff out there. But also when you look at it, you realize that their border, even 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, is not designed to keep people out. It's designed to keep people in. So it's a very interesting sort of verdict on, modern Russia when you think about it. But the interesting thing about that area is there's a lot of Russian-speaking Norwegians. There are a lot of Norwegians who actually fought with the Russians against the Germans in World War II. People from, if you've ever been to Norway, bring your own alcohol because it costs like a bomb to buy like a bottle of whiskey up there.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So people, and petrol too. So people drive across the border into Russia all the time to get vodka and gasoline, right?
Wow.
Meanwhile, Russians come into Kirkenes, which is the big town up there, to get diapers. For some reason, the Russian economy can't make a decent diaper even 30 years after communism, and to get aircraft flights to go to the rest of Europe. So there's a lot of cross-border traffic. There's intelligence activity goes on. There's cross-border movement. A few years ago, 5,000 Afghan and Middle Eastern refugees came across the border in basically 1-2 week period in this one little crossing point up there in the Arctic. And it's like, how did they get there? Well, they had help, and a lot of what the Russians have been doing to the Europeans and to us and to others, I think you can see that happening on the ground up in Norway. And again, I always like to make it concrete so people can have a visual, right? Yeah. And what are we actually talking about here? You can talk in sort of platitudes about the generic nature of it, but people, you can lose people in that. So I try to be as concrete as I can.
I want to thank my friends at Black Rifle Coffee for sponsoring the Danger Close podcast. I've been a huge fan for the longest time. Drink Black Rifle Coffee every day. And if you keep your eyes peeled, you will notice that perhaps Chris Pratt is wearing a Black Rifle Coffee t-shirt, not unsimilar to this one, in the Amazon series adaptation of The Terminal List. Now you can go to blackriflecoffee.com/dangerclose and use code DangerClose20 at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. Black Rifle Coffee, America's coffee. Keep crushing. Kara Frederick. Kara serves as the director of the Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation. She previously served as a counterterrorism analyst at the Department of Defense and was a senior intelligence analyst for a U.S. Naval Special Warfare Command. Following her time at the Department of Defense, she helped create Facebook's Global Security Counterterrorism Analysis Program and led the Facebook headquarters regional intelligence team. Here's Kara.
I mean, you're out there on the front lines of this thing. And for people who have heard of Section 230 passed in a pre-internet world, people hear about it and as they're passing the TV, taking care of the kids, and they're kind of like, what? So, but the way I've heard you explain it before, and I love how you explain it, but it comes from the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which also is a is a strange title. I mean, I don't know. Some of these ones that when they have titles like that, it makes me go, interesting. So even the title of that one, I don't like. But from a pre-internet world, and it was supposed to take out content that was otherwise objectionable, I think and then otherwise objectionable has turned into anyone I don't agree with as big tech, or maybe someone with a conservative view. So that content that is otherwise objectionable seems to have been interpreted to mean what it didn't. But they didn't think it meant 1996, I guess. But when someone else said, the 26 words that created the internet or something like that is part of that, I guess. It was part of it's trying to help build this new thing called the internet back then. But it's really turned into a censorship, allowing people, these big tech companies to censor. But can you describe that, what really this section is and how it's impacting us today?
Yeah, so it's famously described as the 26 words that created the internet. And the whole idea behind Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was that it gives these platforms, essentially these social media companies, these covered companies, so these internet services burgeoning, in the 1990s, the ability to have immunity from civil liability for content that's on their platform. So say in the comments section of one of these new companies, somebody's like, I'm gonna kill everyone. It makes sure that people can't sue those companies for something some rando posts in the comment. And it also gives them cover for sort of good faith efforts to purge some of this content from their platforms as well, because you don't want smut on the platforms, right? It would just be a horrible user experience if the first thing that happens when you open up Twitter is naked bodies and et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. It could be good for some people, not for me, not for my eyes or my future daughter's eyes or anything like that. So it basically allowed these companies to sort of thrive and flourish without the specter of litigation sort of haunting them and frankly stifling them in the crib. And however, you mentioned the otherwise objectionable bit. I mean, you give tech companies an inch and they have taken a mile. So they've used the otherwise objectionable quote to frankly just remove a lot of conservative content. And they're doing that now. So easy fix, strike that from Section 230. Don't allow these platforms to have immunity from civil liability if they censor based off of political viewpoints, and clarify what is protected under the First Amendment through Section 230 as well. Because we're trying to drive these platforms to at least a First Amendment standard as their guiding principle, as something that they look to and they value, unlike what the Twitter CEO has said before, so that can color all of their content moderation and policy decisions going forward. So far, we're not seeing that happening, but there's a lot of stuff, a lot of drafts going around on the Hill that hopefully we'll get some purchase sooner rather than later.
Yeah. So when thinking about that, we've been hearing this Section 230 for a while now, last few years anyway. And I guess our government moves very slowly. It's a gigantic bureaucracy, but they don't seem in a rush to fix this. And they want to calm everybody down by hauling a couple tech executives in front of Congress every now and again, and asking them some questions and that sort of a thing. But are they so tightly connected now, and there's so much money involved that it won't happen? Or is it just going to be a delay after delay after delay, and a little bit of appeasement here and there just to keep us distracted via these same companies with things that they can put out there to keep us from focusing on these issues that weren't really, they're issues for us, yes, but really it's for the next generation and the generation after that. So the decisions that we make today and the policies we put in place today, yeah, fine for us, but it's for our kids and our grandkids and their kids. It's for the future of this country, really. And you're on the front lines of that. But is the connection now so tight, and are they so powerful, big government and big tech, that if we get anything, it's just going to be a little bit of appeasement?
Honestly, so I'm not a cynic.
I know. Sorry. I try to remain hopeful publicly, but
no. I'm going to be pretty controversial here for a buttoned-up conservative in DC. But I think that Washington has lost the plot. I think the hope is in, the new younger generation of representatives that understand the threat, that are, intimately familiar with how these companies work. And they're willing to, people like Blake Masters, JD Vance is really smart. We don't endorse candidates with the Heritage Foundation, but on this topic, these guys are great. And they understand the dangers, because right now, sort of establishment DC, there's, again, not a cynic, but there's so much money to be had from these tech companies. If you've seen some of the figures, they're doling out tens of millions of dollars for lobbying efforts. And this is manifest right now on the Hill. The Hill is about to head into August recess, and they haven't brought a lot of these antitrust bills, these anti-competitive bills to the floor, because, Schumer's got two daughters who work in tech. They're just pumping money into these campaigns, into their progeny, into these industry groups that profess to sort of stick up for, the regular taxpayer and the consumer, but are also taking money from TikTok. So they're effectively Chinese Communist Party shills. Again, not a cynic, but this summer in particular, it has been crazy to see how really, I think they see a lot of these bills potentially and these actions as existential threats, which to me is, okay, that's a good thing, right? Like, if they're actually scared of what somebody in Washington will do, number one, that's new. And number two, that's probably a good thing, because it's going to shape the behavior of these tech companies. Because as you said before, and I think this is the end, this is what it matters in the beginning, and at the end of it all, is that it's about self-governance. It's about our ability to maintain a self-governing republic, because right now these companies have consolidated power. We should be skeptical of concentrations of power. It's a conservative tradition. I'm a conservative, so I'm naturally skeptical of this. And all of what they're able to do to us in the content moderation practices, et cetera, are downstream, as others have said, from this concentration of power. And any sort of threat to that has got them quaking in their boots. And it's effectively delaying a lot of these anti-competitive measures that really good people of goodwill, I think, who understand the threat fully and can diagnose the problem, want on the floor. So I think we've got an uphill battle to fight. I think there are a lot of forces against us, but I think there's sort of a next generation that understands the issue and is going to continue the fight.
Well, I'm glad you're hopeful. It seems like that Section 230 in particular, or the entire Communications Decency Act, has really become an anti-American totalitarian tool, which was not its original intent. And I always like to look back at intent, rather than what people are wordsmithing today or twisting today or manipulating to get some sort of the outcome they want. What was the original intent of something? So I like to go back to that, but they don't want you to look at the original intent for the most part. Distraction, look over here type of a thing. And you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to ask you about it, but it's about using these counterterrorism tools that we've developed, let's say from 9/11 forward, and labeling people as terrorists or domestic extremists to unlock some of those tools, some of those powers that are held by the federal government. The Department of Justice starting a domestic terrorism unit to look at anti-authority and anti-government ideologies, and really scare people into not questioning government policies. That seems to be their intent by doing these things. But we gave the government a lot of power in the years following 9/11. And now applying these labels, and I always go back to something that an old Special Forces sniper from Vietnam told me a long time ago, and he said, precision in language reflects precision in thought. And they're certainly using domestic extremists, terrorists, anti-government ideologies, anti-authority ideologies for a reason. So what are you doing that's focused on that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh, this is huge. And, apart from the threat of, having children growing up with these devices attached to their faces and what that does to their spiritual formation and the formation of their consciences, I'd say this is the more near-term threat. It's not the ridgeline threat, as we in the intel world would say, but this is our near-term issue. So what's happened, and I think this for your listeners, when the FBI was instructed by Merrick Garland to start tagging parents who showed up at these school board meetings and protested critical race theory teaching in their public schools when the FBI started tagging them as potential terrorist threats at the behest of the National School Board Association, which worked with the White House to construct a letter to do so. That's a problem. That's the biggest manifestation. You've got the FBI looking at parents as potential, quote, terrorists. And you and I know that, like precision in language, that, as you said, unlocks specific powers. So it is very, very deliberate that they are using this language so that they basically can expand their ability to surveil and target everyday Americans. In this case, parents. So that's just one data point, but it's pervasive. We're seeing this with the creation of the anti-terrorism unit at the DOJ, looking at anti-government or anti-authority ideologies. You'll probably remember on February 7th, the DHS issued a bulletin basically saying that spreading COVID misinformation is tantamount to terrorist activity. So all of the things that you and I used to look at and to effectively work on has sort of been co-opted and used to look at American citizens rather than legitimate external threats. And this is a problem. This is a pattern. The Disinformation Governance Board sort of doing the same thing when we're treating our own fellow citizens as the enemy and not the real enemy, which is the CCP, and legitimate terrorists were actually looking to harm us from the outside. So this to me is something I think that, as you said, if we're going to be citizens and not subjects, we have to push against this with everything that we can, because to just sort of quietly sleepwalk into this system that works with private companies and the government together to target Americans, that is going to be our undoing. We're frankly going to lose the republic if we allow this to continue.
Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. Links to the full episodes and books are in the show notes. If you enjoyed these conversations, be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. OfficialJackCarr.com is the website. You can sign up for the newsletter there and click on shop for the merch. And until the next time, take care out there. Stay safe, be strong, keep fighting.